So modeling workflows are crucial when you're first starting out. I remember when I first started and I got into like box modeling and spline modeling. And I didn't really realize that there's this whole other different world out here with 3D modeling for different types of surfaces. And I remember it being super difficult to do things like, rocks, characters, all these different things. So it's crucial when you're first starting to understand that there are different types of workflows for modeling. These are not going to be Blender specific. So once you understand the techniques here, you can apply these in any 3D modeling package. So spline and curve modeling, this is going to be the easiest stuff to start with. And you can think of these as 2D objects. So any kind of object that has like a profile like this, that you then turn into a 3D object like this. So profile curve right here. You can think of this curve modeling, spline modeling, and then you generate the 3D mesh from there. So box modeling is going to be the most common type of modeling, especially for props. It's when you take a primitive shape, it doesn't have to be a box, it can be a sphere, a cylinder, or whatever it may be, and then you turn that into a different surface. So you start with a basic cube, and then, later on So we're going to be getting into this heavily in this course. Subdivision modeling, or otherwise known as sub-D modeling. So this is when you basically start with a low poly mesh. In this case right here, we have a cube, and then you subdivide it to turn it into the final mesh. In this case, it's being turned into a sphere. So you can think of this as cage modeling. In this case right here, we have just a cube, we insert an edge loop, and now we essentially have like a bullet shape. So we're going to be doing this heavily as well in this course. So these three are probably the most important when you're first starting out. Spline curve modeling, that's going to be this, and then box modeling in combination with subdivision modeling are going to be really, really crucial. So sculpting, you can think of this as like traditional clay sculpting. This is when you get out of working with polygons and quads and things like that, and you just are pushing and pulling just like clay, just like you would be doing a practical traditional sculpt. So this starts to become super important when you start to doing things like organic surfaces, like characters, or anything in exterior environmental. Boolean modeling is when you essentially take two or more objects and you add or subtract them to create a new mesh. So this can be really kind of abused when you're first starting out. So you don't want to lean on this stuff too much. You want to stick with your box modeling for sure, but as you start to progress and as you start to get into more things like hard surface modeling, it can become super essential. Generally speaking, n-gons can be a very misunderstood thing, which we'll talk about as we go. They can be super problematic in pipelines. They can be, a big headache. So you really have to know what you're doing to really utilize this stuff. I would say, generally speaking, the closer you get to just be doing general concept, just doing concept art, the more you can utilize this stuff. And the more you get towards doing like characters and deformation, the less you definitely want to stay away from this stuff. And then there's a middle ground where you have like things like hard surface objects where you can start to utilize this stuff if you know what you're doing. So it's definitely not necessarily a beginner's thing that you want to lean on early on. Metaballs are going to be essentially things like liquid surfaces. So we have things like this where we have 1, 2, and 3 different points that we generate a mesh from. So you can think of this as just, bubbles or anything liquid. NURBS, so this is going to be something that was, very, very common like 15 years ago. It's not as much used today just because we lean on things like subdivision and box modeling to do this kind of stuff. But basically it's, 2D curves, and then you create a 3D surface from that. So there are some uses for NURBS surfaces still to this day. I wouldn't say they're absolutely 100%, but definitely not nearly as used as they were, 10, 15 years ago. Displacement, this is going to be anything like bricks, any type of rocky type surfaces. We don't want to actually model all this stuff individually. Even sculpting this could be, generally speaking, not the best thing to do for all cases. So essentially, this is just a piece of geometry that has a texture applied to it as a displacement that's generating this rocky surface. So photogrammetry is going to be a type of way to generate an asset, both models and textures based on photographies, based on photos. So the workflow here is essentially you just take photos a ton of photos just in a circle around an object, and then you run those photos through a photogrammetry package. This is Meshroom. It's probably the most common one that I'm aware of. It's free, it's awesome, and it's really, really good for just generating background, midground, those types of assets. Anything that needs to be photorealistic, anything that isn't highly reflective, things that exist in nature like trees, rocks, those types of things can be really, really good for this type of workflow. Camera projections. So these are going to be really, really useful whenever you're needing a still image that needs to be turned into an animated camera. So you can think of this kind of like photogrammetry, but instead of using a bunch of different images, you start with one image. So if we look in here and we have, this example right here, we have this still frame that is then being projected onto very basic shapes. So just boxes, those types of things. And what that allows you to do is it allows you to push and pull a camera in this scene. So obviously you can't do it too much. You can't just fly all the way to the back here and turn around the corner. Things like cars and highly reflective surfaces don't work really, really well with this technique, but it's really, really common whenever you're needing to composite a car into a scene. So say you're doing something like live action and you need to have the car reflect an environment, you would use the camera plate and project that onto geometry to get those reflections. Or doing things like bigger landscapes, things like mountains, things like cityscapes can be really, really common with that workflow. And the last thing is just opacity. So it's important to know this too, where if we have things like leaves and that kind of stuff, we don't want to model this. We just want to use an alpha map. So a black and white map that is going to be then used to cut out a surface. So now you're not actually polygon modeling it. You're just using an opacity map. So to wrap this up, what you want to start with when you're first starting is definitely going to be these top three right here: spline, box, and sub D. These are the ones that we're going to focus on the most here. And we'll dive into a little bit of sculpting and booleans and metaballs.